The Hartwell Conservatory of Music sat like a palace in the heart of Boston. Its tall windows glowed golden at night, and the sound of pianos and violins floated through its marble hallways. It was a place for the gifted, a place for the chosen, a place where dreams came true for those lucky enough to walk through its doors as students. Elena Vargas was not one of those people. She walked through those same doors every evening at 6 o'clock. But she carried a mop instead of a violin case. She wore a faded blue uniform instead of designer clothes. And when the students and professors passed her in the hallways, they looked right through her like she was invisible. Elena was 32 years old. She had worked as a janitor at the conservatory for almost 4 years now. The pay was not great, but the job was steady. It helped her pay rent for the tiny apartment she shared with her mother in a rough part of the city. It put food on the table. It kept the lights on. That was enough. It had to be enough. Every night, after the last student left and the last professor locked their office, Elena would begin her rounds. She started on the 3rd floor and worked her way down. She cleaned the practice rooms first, picking up forgotten water bottles and wiping rosin dust from the floors. Then she moved to the classrooms, erasing whiteboards covered with musical notes she still understood perfectly. Finally, she ended her shift in the grand concert hall on the 1st floor. The concert hall was her favorite place in the building. It had 500 velvet seats that curved around a wide wooden stage. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. The acoustics were so perfect that even a whisper could reach the back row. Elena always saved this room for last. She would sweep between the rows slowly, letting herself breathe in the silence. Sometimes, if she was alone, she would close her eyes and imagine herself standing on that stage. She would hear the applause in her mind. She would feel the weight of a violin against her shoulder. But then she would open her eyes, and she would remember that those days were gone. Most people at the conservatory did not know anything about Elena's past. They did not know that she had been born in a small village in Guatemala. They did not know that her father, a carpenter named Roberto, had traded 6 months of his labor to a local merchant just to buy his daughter a violin when she was 5 years old. The instrument was old and scratched, with a crack running down its back. But to Elena, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Her father could not read music. He could not teach her technique or theory. But he sang folk songs while he worked. And Elena would listen carefully, and then figure out how to play them on her own. By the time she was 7, people in the village started calling her a miracle. By the time she was 10, she was performing at churches, and weddings, and town festivals. By 12, a music teacher from the city heard her play and said she had the kind of talent that comes along once in a generation. Everything was possible. The whole world was waiting for her. And then, everything fell apart. Violence came to their region like a storm. Elena's family had no choice but to flee. They left behind their home, their friends, their entire life. They crossed borders with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the hope that America would give them a second chance. It did, but at a terrible cost. Elena's mother got sick during their first winter in Boston. The cold was brutal, and their apartment had no heat. Doctors said she needed medicine that cost more money than they had. Elena's father worked double shifts at a warehouse, but it was not enough. So Elena did the only thing she could think of. She sold her violin. The man at the pawn shop gave her $200 for it. She handed over the money for her mother's medicine that same night. Her mother survived, but something inside Elena did not. She never touched a violin again after that. It hurt too much. Every time she heard one playing on the radio or in the street, she would feel a sharp pain in her chest like a piece of glass was stuck there. So she learned to avoid music. She learned to keep her head down. She learned to forget who she used to be. 15 years passed. Now here she was, a janitor at one of the most famous music schools in the country. Some nights, she wondered if this was fate's idea of a cruel joke. Other nights, she told herself it did not matter. The past was the past. She had a job to do. One Thursday evening in late October, Elena was mopping the stage of the concert hall when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and saw a woman walking down the center aisle toward her. The woman was tall and thin, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore a black dress and carried a violin case made of expensive leather. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor with each step. Elena recognized her immediately. Everyone at the conservatory knew Victoria Ashford. Victoria was one of the most famous violinists in the world. She had performed at concert halls in Paris, Vienna, Tokyo, and New York. Critics called her a genius. Students competed fiercely just to sit in her masterclasses. She was brilliant, elegant, and absolutely terrifying. She was also known for being cold. Some said cruel. She had made students cry in front of entire audiences. She had ended careers with a single review. People respected her, but very few people liked her. Elena quickly stepped aside and lowered her eyes as Victoria climbed onto the stage. Victoria did not acknowledge her. She simply opened her case, removed her violin, and began to tune. Then she lifted the bow and started to play. The music filled the empty hall like water filling a glass. It was fast and fierce, full of sharp turns and impossible runs. Elena stood frozen by the edge of the stage, her mop dripping onto the floor. She knew this piece. She knew it in her bones. Without thinking, Elena closed her eyes. Her body began to sway slightly, her fingers twitching at her sides as if they remembered movements from another lifetime. For a few seconds, she was not a janitor in a faded uniform. She was a little girl in Guatemala, playing under a mango tree while her father clapped and cheered. Then the music stopped. Elena opened her eyes and found Victoria staring directly at her. "You," Victoria said, her voice sharp. "What do you think you are doing?" Elena's heart dropped. "I am sorry, ma'am. I did not mean to disturb you. I was just finishing cleaning and— Do you even know what piece I was playing?" Victoria interrupted. Her eyes were cold, like 2 chips of ice. Elena hesitated. She knew she should stay quiet. She knew she should apologize again and walk away. But something stopped her. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the ghost of the girl she used to be. "Paganini," Elena said softly. "Caprice number 24. Victoria raised one eyebrow. For a moment, she looked almost surprised. Then her expression hardened again. "Lucky guess," she said with a thin smile. "People like you probably think classical music is just background noise for elevators and shopping malls." Elena felt the words hit her like a slap. She wanted to say something. She wanted to tell this woman that she had performed Paganini before Victoria had ever heard of him. She wanted to scream that she had given up everything. Everything. And she did not deserve to be spoken to like this, but she said nothing. She just picked up her mop and walked away, her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. Victoria watched her go, already forgetting her. But Elena would not forget this night. And soon, neither would Victoria. A week passed after that night in the concert hall. Elena tried to forget what had happened. She told herself it did not matter. Victoria Ashford was just another rich person who looked down on workers like her. There were plenty of people like that in the world. Elena had learned long ago not to let their words cut too deep. But late at night, when she lay in her small bed and stared at the ceiling, she could still hear Victoria's voice. "People like you." The words echoed in her mind like a song she could not stop humming. People like you. What did that even mean? People who worked hard? People who sacrificed everything for their families? People who once had dreams but had to bury them just to survive? Elena turned over and closed her eyes. She needed to sleep. Tomorrow was going to be a long day. The conservatory was hosting a special event on Saturday evening. It was called the Autumn Gala, and it happened every year. Wealthy donors came from all over the country to drink champagne, listen to music, and write big checks to support the school. The students performed, the professors showed off, and the janitors worked twice as hard to make sure everything looked perfect. Elena had been assigned to help serve refreshments during the event. She did not love the idea of walking around with a tray while rich people ignored her. But the job paid extra, and her mother needed new medicine. So she ironed her uniform, tied her hair back neatly, and showed up early on Saturday to help set up. The concert hall looked different that night. The staff had arranged round tables covered in white cloth across the floor. Candles flickered on every surface. Flowers spilled out of tall vases. A string quartet played softly in the corner while guests arrived in silk dresses and tailored suits. Elena moved through the crowd like a shadow. She offered glasses of sparkling water and small plates of food. She smiled politely when someone thanked her. She kept her eyes down when they did not. Most of the guests barely noticed her. They were too busy talking about their vacation homes and their children's achievements and the latest opera they had seen in New York. Elena listened to their conversations without really hearing them. She had learned how to be invisible a long time ago. Around 8 o'clock, the main performance began. The string quartet stopped playing, and the lights dimmed. A spotlight appeared on the stage, and Victoria Ashford stepped into it. She looked stunning, as always. Her silver hair was swept up elegantly, and she wore a deep red gown that caught the light when she moved. She held her violin like it was part of her body. The audience applauded loudly as she took her place at the center of the stage. Victoria smiled, but it was not a warm smile. It was the kind of smile a cat gives a mouse before pouncing. "Good evening, everyone," she said into the microphone. Her voice was smooth and controlled. "Thank you all for coming tonight. Your generosity keeps this institution alive. Because of you, we can continue to nurture the finest musical talent in the country." More applause. Victoria waited for it to die down before continuing. "Tonight, I want to talk about what separates true artists from ordinary people. You see, music is not just about hitting the right notes. Anyone can learn to do that with enough practice. Real music comes from something deeper. It comes from breeding, from culture, from a certain kind of soul that cannot be taught." Elena was standing near the back of the room, holding an empty tray. She felt a strange chill run down her spine as she listened. "Some people are born to create beauty," Victoria continued. "And some people are born to, well, appreciate it from a distance. There is no shame in that. The world needs audiences just as much as it needs performers." A few guests chuckled politely. Elena gripped her tray tighter. Then Victoria's eyes began scanning the room. They moved slowly across the crowd, past the donors in their expensive clothes, past the students standing nervously by the walls. And then they stopped. They stopped on Elena. "You there," Victoria called out. "Come here. Please." Elena froze. For a moment, she thought she must have misheard. But everyone in the room was turning to look at her now. 100 pairs of eyes, all staring. "Yes, you," Victoria said, pointing directly at her. "The woman with the tray. Come up to the stage." Elena's legs felt like they were made of stone. She wanted to run. She wanted to disappear. But she could not move. A man near her gave her a little push. "Go on," he whispered. "She is calling you." Somehow, Elena made her feet work. She walked through the crowd, feeling every gaze burn into her skin. The distance to the stage felt like 100 miles. When she finally reached the steps, she climbed them slowly, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her chest. Victoria was waiting for her with that same cold smile. "What is your name?" Victoria asked. She held the microphone toward Elena like a weapon. "Elena," she managed to say. Her voice came out barely louder than a whisper. "Elena," Victoria repeated, turning to the audience. "Elena works here as a cleaning woman. She mops our floors and empties our trash cans. Very important work, I am sure." A few people laughed. Elena felt her face grow hot. "Last week, I caught Elena listening to me practice," Victoria continued. "And do you know what she did? She told me exactly what piece I was playing. Paganini's Caprice No. 24. Can you imagine?" The audience murmured. Some looked impressed, others looked confused. So I thought, why not give her a chance to show us what she knows? Victoria's eyes gleamed with something dark. "After all, we are always looking for hidden talent. Are we not?" She turned to one of her students standing nearby and held out her hand. The young man hesitated, then handed over his violin. Victoria pushed the instrument toward Elena. "Go ahead," she said. "Play something for us. Anything you like. Show these generous donors where their charity money goes." Elena stared at the violin. It was beautiful. Polished wood, perfect strings, a bow made of fine horsehair. It looked nothing like the old, scratched instrument her father had given her so many years ago, but it was still a violin, and Elena had not touched one in 15 years. I cannot, she stammered. I do not play anymore. Oh, come now, Victoria said loudly. Surely you can manage something. You seemed so confident last week when you were correcting me. Anyone can scrape a bow across strings, can they not? The audience was silent now. No one was laughing anymore. Elena could see some guests shifting uncomfortably in their seats. A few looked away, embarrassed. But no one spoke up. No one told Victoria to stop. Elena's hands were shaking. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. She thought about her father, who had worked so hard to give her that first violin. She thought about her mother, who had cried when Elena sold it. She thought about all the years she had spent trying to forget, trying to move on, trying to convince herself that music did not matter anymore. Victoria leaned closer. "What is wrong?" she whispered, soft enough that only Elena could hear. "Are you going to cry? That would be rather pathetic, do you not think?" Something inside Elena shifted. It was not anger, exactly. It was something older than that, something deeper. It was the same feeling she had when she was a little girl, standing in front of a crowd for the first time, terrified but determined. She had spent 15 years being invisible, 15 years being small, 15 years letting the world tell her who she was and what she deserved. Maybe it was time to stop. Elena reached out and took the violin from Victoria's hands. The room went completely silent. Victoria blinked, clearly surprised. She had expected Elena to run away. She had expected tears and humiliation. She had not expected this. Elena lifted the violin to her shoulder. It felt strange and familiar at the same time, like meeting an old friend after many years apart. Her fingers found their positions on the strings without her even thinking about it. Her other hand gripped the bow. She closed her eyes, and somewhere deep inside her, a door that had been locked for 15 years slowly began to open. The concert hall was so quiet that Elena could hear her own heartbeat. It thumped in her ears like a drum, fast and unsteady. Her palms were sweating. Her knees felt weak. 100 people were watching her, waiting for her to fail. Victoria stood a few feet away with her arms crossed. That cruel smile was still on her face, but there was something else in her eyes now. A flicker of uncertainty. She had not expected Elena to actually take the violin. She had expected the cleaning woman to burst into tears and run off the stage in shame. But Elena was still standing there. The violin was pressed against her shoulder. The bow was trembling slightly in her right hand. For a long moment, nothing happened. Elena just stood there with her eyes closed, breathing slowly. The audience began to shift in their seats. Someone coughed. Someone else whispered something to their neighbor. Victoria's smile grew wider. "Having trouble?" she asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. Perhaps this was a mistake. Not everyone is meant to. And then Elena began to play. The first note came out rough and uncertain. It wobbled in the air like a newborn bird trying to fly. A few people in the audience winced. Victoria let out a small laugh, but Elena did not stop. She played another note, then another. Her fingers were stiff at first, clumsy from years of not practicing. The sounds she made were not beautiful. They were scratchy and uneven, like someone trying to speak a language they had almost forgotten. But with each passing second, something began to change. It was as if Elena's hands were waking up from a very long sleep. The music started to smooth out. The notes began to connect. Her bow moved across the strings with more confidence, more control, and slowly, very slowly, a melody began to form. It was not a famous piece. It was not Paganini or Bach or any composer the audience would recognize. It was a simple folk song from Guatemala, the kind of tune that mothers sing to their children at bedtime. Elena's father used to hum it while he worked in his carpenter shop. She had learned to play it when she was only 6 years old. The melody floated through the concert hall like smoke rising from a fire. It was soft and sad, full of longing and memory. It spoke of home, of loss, of love that never dies even when everything else is gone. The audience stopped shifting in their seats. The whispers stopped. Even Victoria's smile began to fade. Elena kept her eyes closed. She was not in Boston anymore. She was back in her village, standing under the mango tree in her family's yard. She could smell the wood shavings from her father's workshop. She could hear her mother humming along from the kitchen window. She could feel the warm sun on her face and the rough bark of the tree against her back. The music poured out of her like water breaking through a dam. 15 years of silence. 15 years of grief. 15 years of pretending she did not miss this more than anything in the world. It all came out through the violin. When the folk song ended, Elena did not stop. Without even thinking about it, she transitioned into something else. Something bigger. Something that made the air in the room feel electric. It was Bach, the Chaconne from Partita No. 2 in D minor. This was not a simple folk tune. This was one of the most difficult pieces ever written for solo violin. Professional musicians spent years trying to master it. Some never did. It required perfect technique, incredible stamina, and a depth of emotion that could not be faked. Elena had learned it when she was 12, just before her family fled Guatemala. Her teacher had told her she was too young, that the piece was too advanced, but Elena had practiced it anyway, night after night, until she could play it from memory. Now, 15 years later, her fingers remembered every note. The music exploded through the concert hall. It started low and mournful, a single voice crying out in the darkness. Then it began to build, layer upon layer, growing more complex and more powerful with each phrase. The violin sang and wept and raged. It told stories of death and resurrection, of despair and hope, of endings that were also beginnings. Elena's body moved with the music. She swayed and bent, her whole being consumed by the sound she was creating. Her calloused hands flew across the strings with a speed and precision that seemed impossible. Her bow arm danced through the air like it had a mind of its own. The audience sat frozen. No one moved. No one breathed. They had come to this gala expecting polite entertainment from talented students. They had not expected this. They had not expected to witness something that felt almost sacred. An elderly man in the front row leaned forward in his chair, his mouth slightly open. His name was Harold Whitman, and he had been donating to the conservatory for over 40 years. He had heard the greatest violinists in the world perform. He had sat in the finest concert halls on every continent, but he had never seen anything quite like this. This woman was not just playing music. She was living it. Every note came from somewhere deep inside her. Somewhere real and raw and honest. There was no pretense. No performance. There was only truth. Tears began to roll down Harold's weathered cheeks. He did not wipe them away. Behind him, a young student clutched her program so tightly that it crumpled in her hands. She was in her 3rd year at the conservatory. She had won competitions. She had been praised by professors. But watching Elena play, she realized she had never truly understood what music could be. Victoria Ashford stood at the edge of the stage, completely still. Her arms were no longer crossed. They hung limply at her sides. Her face had gone pale, and the cruel confidence that usually filled her eyes was gone. She was watching a ghost. A woman she had dismissed as nothing, as less than nothing, was standing in front of a room full of the most important people in the classical music world, and playing at a level that Victoria herself could barely match. How was this possible? Who was this woman? Elena did not see any of this. Her eyes were still closed. She was lost in the music, lost in the memory, lost in the person she used to be, and had tried so hard to forget. The chaconne built toward its climax. The notes came faster and faster, higher and higher. Elena's whole body trembled with the effort. Sweat dripped down her face. Her fingers ached, but she did not stop. She could not stop. This was who she was. This was who she had always been. Not a janitor, not a cleaning woman, not someone to be looked through and laughed at and forgotten. She was a musician. She was an artist. She was Elena Vargas, and she had finally remembered. The last notes of the chaconne rang out through the concert hall. They hung in the air for a long moment, vibrating with power and emotion. Then, they faded into silence. Elena lowered the violin. Her arms were shaking. Her legs felt like they might give out at any second. She opened her eyes slowly, almost afraid of what she might see. The room was completely still. No one clapped. No one moved. For a terrible second, Elena thought she had failed. She thought the audience was sitting in embarrassed silence, waiting for her to leave so they could pretend this had never happened. Then Harold Whitman rose to his feet. He brought his hands together once, twice, 3 times. The sound of his applause echoed through the silent hall like thunder, and then everyone else stood up too. The applause crashed over Elena like a wave. It was not polite or restrained. It was wild and overwhelming, the kind of applause that shakes the walls and makes the chandeliers tremble. People were cheering. Some were crying. One woman in the back was shouting, "Bravo," over and over again. Elena stood alone in the spotlight, still holding the borrowed violin, tears streaming down her face. She had spent 15 years in silence. Tonight, the silence was finally over. The applause went on for what felt like forever. Elena stood in the center of the stage, completely overwhelmed. She did not know what to do with her hands. She did not know where to look. The violin hung loosely at her side, and tears kept falling down her cheeks no matter how hard she tried to stop them. People were on their feet everywhere she looked. Some were clapping so hard their hands must have hurt. Others were wiping their eyes with handkerchiefs and napkins. A few just stood there, staring at her, like they had witnessed something impossible. Elena wanted to run. She wanted to disappear into the shadows backstage and pretend none of this had ever happened. But her legs would not move. It was like she was frozen in place, trapped in the spotlight while the whole world watched. Slowly, the applause began to fade. People started sitting back down, still buzzing with excitement. Conversations broke out across the room. Elena could hear fragments of what they were saying. "Who is she? Did you know she worked here? That was incredible. Absolutely incredible. Where did she learn to play like that?" Elena finally found the strength to move. She turned toward the edge of the stage, ready to climb down the steps and vanish into the crowd. But before she could take a single step, someone blocked her path. It was Harold Whitman. The elderly man had walked right up to the stage. He was looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. His eyes were still wet from crying, but there was something else there too. Curiosity, wonder, maybe even respect. "Young woman," he said, his voice quiet but steady, "please do not leave just yet." Elena stopped. She did not know who this man was, but something about him made her want to listen. "What is your name?" he asked. "Elena," she managed to say. "Elena Vargas. Elena." He repeated it slowly, like he was tasting the word. "That was the most extraordinary thing I have heard in a very long time, and I have heard a lot of music in my 82 years. Elena did not know how to respond. She was not used to compliments. She was not used to being seen at all. "Where did you study?" Harold continued. "Which conservatory? Which teacher?" Elena shook her head. "I did not study anywhere, sir. I never had formal training. I did not study anywhere." Harold's eyebrows rose. "No formal training? That is impossible. The piece you just played, the Bach Chaconne, that requires years of dedicated practice. Decades. Even, my father taught me," Elena said softly. "He was a carpenter in Guatemala. He could not read music, but he loved it. He bought me a violin when I was 5 years old. I taught myself mostly by listening and practicing." Harold stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned to look at the people around him, as if checking to make sure they had heard what she just said. "Self-taught," he murmured. My God. By now, a small crowd had gathered near the stage. Students, professors, donors, all of them pressing closer to get a better look at the cleaning woman who had just stunned the entire room. Elena felt their eyes on her like heat from a fire. And then Victoria Ashford pushed through the crowd. She had recovered some of her composure, but her face was tight and her jaw was clenched. She walked up to Harold with quick, sharp steps. "Mr. Whitman," she said, forcing a smile. "I see you have met our little surprise of the evening. Quite entertaining, was it not?" Harold turned to look at her. His expression was calm, but there was something cold in his eyes. "Entertaining?" he repeated. "Is that what you call it?" Victoria's smile flickered. "Well, yes. It was a charming little performance. Raw, of course. Unpolished. But charming in its own way." "Unpolished." Harold's voice was flat. "I have sat on the board of this conservatory for 40 years, Victoria. I have heard every student and every professor perform. I have heard you perform many times, and I can tell you, without any hesitation, that what this woman just did was not unpolished. It was extraordinary." Victoria's smile disappeared completely. "Mr. Whitman, with all due respect, she is a janitor. She has no credentials, no training, no background in classical music. One lucky performance does not change that." "Lucky?" Harold shook his head slowly. "You think that was luck?" He turned back to Elena. "Tell me something. Why did you stop playing? With talent like yours, you could have performed anywhere in the world. Why are you working as a cleaning woman?" Elena felt her throat tighten. She had not talked about this with anyone in years, but something about Harold's gentle, patient gaze made her want to tell the truth. "My family came to America when I was 17, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were refugees. We had nothing. And then my mother got very sick. She needed medicine, but we could not afford it. So, I sold my violin to pay for her treatment." The crowd around her went silent. "I could not bring myself to play after that," Elena continued. "Every time I heard a violin, it reminded me of everything I had lost. So I stopped. I tried to forget. I told myself that part of my life was over." She looked down at the borrowed violin in her hands. "But tonight I remembered." Harold was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Your mother," he said. "Is she still alive?" Elena nodded. "Yes, sir. She is still sick, but she is alive. She is the reason I keep working. Everything I earn goes to her medicine and her care." Harold closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing the weight of her words. Then he opened them again and turned to face the conservatory's director, a nervous-looking man who had been watching from the edge of the crowd. "Dr. Patterson," Harold said firmly, "I want this woman enrolled in the conservatory. Full scholarship, room, board, everything covered. I will pay for it personally." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Dr. Patterson blinked rapidly. "Mr. Whitman, that is very generous. But there are procedures, auditions, applications, academic requirements." "Did you hear what she just played?" Harold interrupted. "That was her audition. And she passed with flying colors." Victoria stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "This is absurd. You cannot just hand out scholarships to anyone who can play a tune. She has no education, no pedigree, no connections. She does not belong here." Harold turned to face her. His expression was calm, but his words cut like a blade. "Victoria, I have given more money to this institution than anyone else in its history. I have supported it through good times and bad. I have never asked for anything in return." He paused. "Until now." Victoria opened her mouth to argue, but Harold raised his hand. "This woman has something you cannot teach," he said quietly. "She has soul. She has truth. And she has earned this chance in a way that most of your students never will." He looked at Elena again. "That is, if she wants it. Elena, would you be willing to become a student here? To study music properly? And develop your gift?" Elena could not believe what she was hearing. This had to be a dream. Things like this did not happen in real life. Not to people like her, but Harold was still looking at her, waiting patiently for an answer. And behind him, she could see the faces of the other guests. They were not laughing at her anymore. They were not looking through her like she was invisible. They were seeing her, really seeing her. Elena thought about her mother, who had sacrificed so much to give her a better life. She thought about her father, who had traded 6 months of his labor just to buy her that first violin. She thought about the little girl in Guatemala who used to dream of performing on the biggest stages in the world. That little girl was still in there somewhere. She had been sleeping for 15 years. But tonight, she had finally woken up. Elena looked at Harold Whitman and took a deep breath. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I want this. More than anything." Harold smiled, and it was the warmest smile Elena had seen in a very long time. "Then it is settled," he said. "Welcome to the Hartwell Conservatory, Elena Vargas." The crowd erupted in applause again, even louder than before. People rushed forward to shake Elena's hand, to congratulate her, to ask her questions. It was chaos, beautiful chaos, and Elena stood in the middle of it all, still holding the borrowed violin, still not quite believing that any of this was real. Somewhere in the back of the crowd, Victoria Ashford stood alone. No one was looking at her anymore. No one was praising her or asking for her opinion. She watched Elena being surrounded by admirers, and for the first time in her life, she felt something she had never felt before. She felt small. 3 years can change everything. Elena stood backstage at Carnegie Hall, holding her violin case against her chest like a shield. Through the heavy curtains, she could hear the low rumble of 2,000 people taking their seats. The greatest concert hall in America was sold out tonight, and every single person out there had come to hear her play. Her, Elena Vargas, the cleaning woman from Guatemala. Sometimes, she still could not believe how much her life had changed. 3 years ago, she had been mopping floors and emptying trash cans. She had been invisible, forgotten. Just another face in the crowd that nobody noticed. And now she was about to walk onto one of the most famous stages in the world. The journey had not been easy. Nothing worth having ever is. After that night at the gala, Elena had thrown herself into her studies at the conservatory with everything she had. She practiced 8 hours a day, sometimes more. She took classes in music theory, history, and composition. She learned things about the violin that she had never known before, techniques and methods that made her playing even stronger. But she also learned something else. She learned that she did not have to forget where she came from. The professors at the conservatory taught her discipline and precision, but the soul of her music still came from that little village in Guatemala. It still came from her father's workshop and her mother's kitchen. It still came from the scratched old violin that she had loved and lost so many years ago. Harold Whitman had been with her every step of the way. He became more than just a donor. He became a mentor, a friend, almost like a grandfather. He attended her recitals and concerts. He gave her advice when she was struggling. He believed in her even when she did not believe in herself. And her mother. Her beautiful, stubborn, wonderful mother. Elena had been able to move her into a better apartment after the first year. The new place had heat that actually worked and windows that let in the sunlight. She had hired a nurse to help take care of her when Elena was busy with classes. And slowly, little by little, her mother's health had started to improve. It was not a miracle. The doctors said she would never be completely well. But she was stronger now. She could walk without help. She could sit in the garden and feel the sun on her face. She could smile again. That was enough. That was more than enough. Tonight, her mother was sitting in the front row of Carnegie Hall. Elena had made sure of it. She had reserved the best seat in the house, right in the center, where she would be able to see everything. Harold was sitting next to her. He had flown in from Boston just for this performance. When Elena had tried to thank him for everything he had done, he had just waved his hand and said that watching her succeed was all the thanks he needed. There was one other person in the audience tonight. Someone Elena had not expected. Victoria Ashford. Elena had heard that Victoria requested a ticket weeks ago. She had not asked for a special seat or any kind of recognition. She had simply bought a ticket, like everyone else, and planned to sit in the third row, alone. At first, Elena did not know how to feel about that. Part of her still remembered the humiliation of that night at the gala. Part of her still felt the sting of Victoria's cruel words. People like you, The memory had never completely faded, but another part of her understood something important. Without Victoria, none of this would have happened. If Victoria had not called her up to that stage, Elena would still be mopping floors. She would still be invisible. She would still be running from the music instead of running toward it. Victoria had meant to break her that night. Instead, she had set her free. Elena did not know if she could ever truly forgive Victoria, but she could be grateful. In a strange, twisted way, Victoria had given her the greatest gift of her life. A stagehand appeared beside her. 5 minutes, Miss Vargas. Elena nodded. Her heart was pounding, but it was a different kind of pounding than before. It was not fear. It was excitement. It was joy. It was the feeling of standing on the edge of something beautiful. She opened her violin case and looked down at the instrument inside. It was not the borrowed student violin from that night at the gala. It was a new one. Handmade by a master craftsman in Italy. Harold had given it to her as a graduation gift. But resting beside it, tucked carefully into the velvet lining, was something else. A small photograph, old and faded, with worn edges and creases from being folded too many times. It was a picture of her father. He was standing in his workshop, covered in sawdust, holding the scratched old violin he had traded 6 months of labor to buy. He was smiling, that big warm smile that Elena remembered so clearly even after all these years. She touched the photograph gently with her fingertips. "I made it, Papa," she whispered. "I finally made it." The stagehand appeared again. "It is time, Miss Vargas." Elena closed the case, leaving the photograph inside. She picked up her violin and bow, took a deep breath, and walked toward the stage. The curtains parted, and light flooded over her. The audience stretched out before her like an ocean of faces. 2,000 people, all watching, all waiting. The applause that greeted her was thunderous, echoing off the walls and ceiling of the great hall. Elena walked to the center of the stage. She could see her mother in the front row, tears already streaming down her face. Harold was clapping so hard. His hands must have hurt. And there, in the third row, sat Victoria. She was not clapping. She was just watching, her expression unreadable. Elena lifted her violin to her shoulder. The hall fell silent. She closed her eyes, just like she had that night 3 years ago. She thought about her father and his sawdust-covered hands. She thought about her mother singing in the kitchen. She thought about the mango tree in their yard, and the sound of chickens clucking in the morning, and the smell of rain on dry earth. And then she began to play. She started with the same folk song she had played at the gala. The simple melody her father used to hum while he worked. It floated through Carnegie Hall like a whisper, soft and sad and full of memory. But this time, it was different. This time, she was not playing to prove anything. She was not playing to survive. She was playing because she loved it, because it was who she was, because after everything she had been through, she had finally found her way back home. The music grew and swelled, filling every corner of the great hall. Elena poured her whole heart into it. All the pain and loss and struggle, all the hope and joy and gratitude, everything she had ever felt, everything she had ever been, flowed through her fingers and into the strings. When the last note faded into silence, Elena opened her eyes. The audience was on its feet. The applause was deafening. People were crying, cheering, shouting her name. It was even louder than that night at the gala, even more overwhelming. But Elena was not looking at the crowd. She was looking at her mother, who was sobbing with happiness in the front row. She was looking at Harold, who was beaming with pride, and she was looking at Victoria, who was still sitting in her seat while everyone else stood. Their eyes met across the crowded hall. And then, slowly, Victoria Ashford rose to her feet. She brought her hands together and began to clap. It was not loud or enthusiastic. It was quiet, almost reluctant, but it was real. It was an apology. It was an acknowledgement. It was the closest thing to respect that Victoria had ever shown her. Elena nodded once, just slightly, a silent acceptance. Then she turned back to the audience, raised her bow, and smiled. She was not a janitor anymore. She was not invisible. She was not the woman who had given up everything and lost herself for 15 years. She was Elena Vargas. She was a musician. And she had finally come home. Sometimes the people who try to break us become the reason we rise. And sometimes the hardest roads lead to the most beautiful places. Elena had walked a very hard road. But standing on that stage, bathed in light, surrounded by love, she knew it had all been worth it. Every single step,